Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for your ears. It was meant to stay buried under stone, locked in archives guarded by men in black robes, sealed behind oaths older than this nation itself. You weren't supposed to know about the 123 children of Santa Eulalia Orphanage, and why none of them walked out alive. In the winter of 1887, workmen digging beneath an abandoned Catholic orphanage in rural Pennsylvania uncovered something that froze their blood. They expected rotten beams, forgotten tools, maybe rats nesting in the rubble. What they found instead were tiny wooden crosses, dozens of them carved by hand. Each one bore a child's name and a date. The names didn't belong to graveyard stones. They belonged to the children who had once lived inside Santa Eulalia. The dates stretched across 17 years, from 1834 to 1851. One cross for every child. One marker for every life extinguished. Do you understand the gravity of that? It means that every child ever housed within those walls, 123 in total, was never meant to leave. That orphanage was not a place of refuge. It was a slaughterhouse hidden behind stained glass, cloaked in scripture, and masked as charity. The workers who found those crosses thought they had uncovered a crime scene. But before they could alert anyone, men from the diocese arrived, swift, efficient, merciless. The evidence was seized. The building was demolished within days. And the men who stumbled onto the truth were bound by silence, bribed and threatened into burying what they had seen. For more than a century, the story of Santa Eulalia has been a ghost whispered only in back alleys and deathbed confessions. But fragments have survived, letters smuggled out by nuns who regretted what they saw, testimonies from children who almost became victims but escaped, and journals kept by the priest who orchestrated it all. These fragments tell us not of charity, but of sacrifice, not of faith, but of control, not of salvation, but of rituals so ancient the church itself pretended to forget them. Tonight, I'm going to take you inside those walls. You will hear the truth the world was never meant to hear. The truth of why 123 children vanished into the black maw of Santa Eulalia. The truth of how obedience can be manufactured, how innocence can be harvested, and how the mask of holiness can hide the face of absolute evil. This is no bedtime story. This is initiation. Once you hear it, you can never return to the man you were before. The town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, in the 1830s was small, quiet, and poor. Barely 300 people lived among its rolling hills and German stone houses. Most were Protestants, suspicious of Catholicism and its foreign priests. But in 1833, a Bavarian priest named Father Heinrich Kellermann arrived. His eyes were ice blue, his voice carried the weight of authority, and he preached with fire about sacrifice, purity, and the price of sin. He came not just to serve the faithful, but to conquer the town's soul. When Father Kellermann opened Santa Eulalia Orphanage the following year, the people saw only mercy. Children starving on the streets were given beds. Orphans of the industrial age, boys whose parents died in the steel mills, girls abandoned by passing strangers, were gathered under one roof. The town applauded. Protestants and Catholics alike praised the good work. They thought it was a beacon of hope. They were wrong. From the beginning, the orphanage was different. The bell tower tolled not only for prayer, but in the middle of the night, over and over, its bronze voice filling the valley. The children were rarely seen playing outside. When they were, they moved like shadows, silent, stiff, obedient. No laughter, no joy, only pale faces and hollow eyes. The merchants who delivered food whispered that the children never spoke, never even looked up, as if their voices had been taken from them. And when townsfolk asked to visit, to check on the little ones, they were denied. Father Kellermann would smile, soft but unyielding, and insist that the children required discipline, that their souls were fragile and must be sheltered from the world. Sounded holy, sounded pious, but it was a cage. The local doctor noticed something too. In 17 years, not once was he called to treat a child from Santa Eulalia. In a town where every child eventually fell ill, scraped a knee or broke a bone, how could these orphans never need his care? Father Kellermann told him Sister Margaret Clare, the nun in charge, had special training. But the doctor later wrote in his private journal that her training was not in medicine. It was in something else. Something older. Something darker. The orphanage was never about charity. It was a laboratory. A place where children were broken down, reshaped, and offered up to powers the town could not see. You must understand, this wasn't just cruelty. It was deliberate, calculated, ritualized. And it was only the beginning. It began with whispers. Children who were seen one week were gone the next. A boy spotted in the yard at dusk, pale and trembling. Never seen again. A girl who had smiled shyly at a merchant through the iron gate. Vanished the following day. When townsfolk asked, the nuns replied with calm, rehearsed voices. They have been placed with good families. God has provided. But no family in Millbrook had taken them. No one had seen them leave. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The first real crack in the mask came on a bitter morning in January 1835. Timothy Fletcher, a 14-year-old delivery boy, arrived at Santa Eulalia with a wagon of supplies. The service door was frozen shut, so he circled to the front. That's when he heard it, crying. Thin, desperate wails, echoing from somewhere deep inside. The kind of sound no child should ever have to make. The front door stood slightly ajar. Against his better judgment, Timothy stepped inside. The air was heavy with candle smoke, laced with something acrid, like burning herbs or medicine gone rotten. The crying grew louder, leading him toward the chapel. And when he peeked through the crack in the door, he saw something that froze him where he stood. Sister Margaret Clare stood at the altar, speaking in rapid Latin. In her arms was a bundle of white cloth, moving, twisting, alive. Around her, a circle of children knelt, their foreheads pressed to the stone floor, their bodies stiff as statues. Their clothes were filthy. Their faces, when Timothy could glimpse them, were gaunt and sickly. They looked less like children, and more like offerings. He wanted to run, but before he could move, a cold hand gripped his wrist. Sister Bernardet, one of the younger nuns, stood behind him, her eyes blazing with fury. Her voice was low, venomous. There is no crying here, only prayer, only purification. She made him swear, on his mother's grave, never to speak of what he had seen. The mark of something dark stained her hands, something that looked far too much like blood. Timothy never delivered to the orphanage again. For the rest of his life, he refused to speak of that day, until his deathbed 60 years later. Only then did he whisper the truth, that Santa Eulalia was no orphanage. It was an altar, and the children were its sacrifice. To understand Santa Eulalia, you must understand Father Heinrich Kellerman, not as a priest but as an architect of control. He did not invent cruelty. He refined it. What he carried with him from Bavaria was not merely theology, but a set of forbidden teachings, fragments of medieval Catholicism that the Church itself had abandoned centuries earlier. Teachings about the purification of the innocent through suffering. In Kellerman's private journals, smuggled out decades later by a terrified nun, he wrote in Latin of a doctrine called ex pies oblatus, from the pious offered. According to this belief, the suffering of children could be harvested, their innocence weaponized, their agony transmuted into something he called virtus sacra, sacred power. The ancient church had outlawed it, branding it superstition, even heresy. But to Kellerman it was the highest truth. And he believed America was the perfect soil to plant it in. Think about that. An orphanage filled with unwanted children, with no family to claim them, no voice to speak for them. Perfect vessels, perfect sacrifices, and to the town it looked like charity. While the Protestants distrusted the orphanage, they could never prove wrongdoing. They saw only hungry mouths fed, cold bodies clothed, empty streets cleared of beggars. They wanted to believe, and belief is the most fertile ground for corruption. Kellerman's sermons grew darker each year. He spoke of obedience, of discipline, of the purifying flame of suffering. The townsfolk nodded politely, perhaps uneasily, but they did not resist. Because resisting meant questioning charity itself, questioning God's work, questioning the authority of the Church. And in 1830s Pennsylvania, that was unthinkable. Inside the walls, however, the doctrine was lived. The bell tolled at midnight not to summon prayer, but to break the children's sleep, to strip away resistance, to bend their minds. Silence was enforced, not as punishment, but as purification. Hunger was a ritual. Pain was sanctified. And when a child disappeared, they were not placed in homes. They were absorbed into the ritual machine Father Kellerman had constructed. You see, this was not random cruelty. It was systematized, structured, a blueprint for control. And what is most terrifying is that Santa Eulalia was not the only place Kellerman tested it. His journals suggest he corresponded with other priests across the young nation, men eager to learn his methods. The orphanage was not an isolated horror. It was a seedbed, and its roots stretched far deeper than Millbrook ever knew. Imagine being 7 years old. You wake in the dark to the tolling of the bell. It doesn't matter if you slept only an hour, the bell is command. You rise barefoot to the stone floor. Around you, dozens of children do the same, eyes hollow, movements mechanical. No words are spoken. Silence is law. At Santa Eulalia, every day was carved into ritual. The children marched in lines, heads bowed, bodies thin as reeds. Meals were sparse, bread hard as stone, broth thin as water. Hunger was constant, and that was the point. Hunger kept them weak. Hunger made them obedient. At dawn they prayed. At noon they worked. At dusk they knelt until their knees bled. And in between they were drilled not in learning but in discipline. Every act was monitored. Every thought bent. The nuns' eyes were everywhere, sharp and unblinking, ensuring that no spark of rebellion could survive. When a child faltered, when they whispered or cried, or clung too tightly to another, they were taken aside. The others would never see them return. Instead, the missing child's bed would be stripped, their names struck from the roll, their existence quietly erased. The nuns would explain, God has provided a family. But the children knew better. Deep in their bones, they knew those words meant one thing, that the child had been chosen. By night, the chapel became something else. Candles lit shadows across the walls. The bell tower tolled like a hammer against the skull. And the chosen child was brought forward, sometimes alone, sometimes in twos. The others were made to watch, heads bowed so low they could barely breathe. The prayers spoken over them were not the gentle lullabies of faith, but guttural incantations in Latin. Words of binding, words of offering. The children lived in constant dread. To be invisible meant survival. To be noticed meant death. Their only hope was silence. Silence of the tongue, silence of the soul. But even silence did not guarantee safety, because Father Kellerman's doctrine demanded more than discipline. It demanded sacrifice, and no matter how many were taken, the bell always tolled again. You see, this was not simply cruelty for its own sake. This was a program. The children were being broken, conditioned, and harvested. And with every life extinguished, Father Kellerman believed he was feeding something greater than himself. Something that lived in the shadows of the chapel, drawn closer with every prayer, every drop of suffering, every vanished child. For years, the town of Millbrook turned a blind eye. The orphanage was the church's work, after all. Who were common farmers, merchants, and blacksmiths to question holy men and veiled women? But the truth has a way of bleeding through, even when buried under ritual and secrecy. And soon, shadows began to fall across the town itself. Merchants delivering food whispered about strange sounds, chants rising like smoke from the chapel at midnight, voices too many to belong only to the nuns. Some said they heard screaming muffled beneath hymns. Others swore the smell of burning flesh lingered in the air long after dawn. Families who had donated clothing began to notice something uncanny. Garments given for boys ended up worn by pale girls in the yard. Dresses sent for girls reappeared on thin, trembling boys. Yet days later, those same children vanished, never to be seen again. When questioned, Father Kellerman smiled and spoke of placements in good homes. But not a single family in Pennsylvania ever admitted to taking one of the children in. Then came the bell. Tolling grew stranger. It rang at odd hours, 2 in the morning, 4 in the afternoon, always in uneven patterns. Some in town began keeping journals, trying to map the rhythm. What they found chilled them. Each irregular toll seemed to precede a child's disappearance. A bell for a life. A toll for a sacrifice. Dr. Whitmore, the town physician, pressed hardest for answers. He confronted Father Kellerman, demanding to see the children, to examine them for sickness. But Kellerman refused, his words calm but sharp. Asterisk. These children are not your concern, doctor. They are in God's hands. Do not interfere in holy work. Asterisk. The rebuke was so cutting, so absolute, that even a man of science stepped back. Because in that age, to stand against the church was to risk exile, ruin, or worse. But suspicion festered. The children who appeared in the yard looked thinner each month. Some residents swore they saw marks on their wrists, bruises along their necks, burns on their arms. Others reported that when they locked eyes with the orphans through the gates, they saw nothing looking back. No spark, no humanity, only emptiness. The town began to whisper, but whispers are weak when men are afraid. And fear was the mortar that sealed Santa Eulalia's walls. By then, a truth had become undeniable. This orphanage was not saving children. It was consuming them. The year was 1891 when the first documented disappearance broke through the silence. Her name was Clara Hayes, a girl of just 10, daughter of a widowed seamstress who had left her at Santa Eulalia hoping for safety and education. Clara was bright, with auburn hair that shone like copper in the sun, and a laugh the other children adored. Then she was gone. Her mother came one Sunday with bread and a handmade dress to gift her daughter, only to be told, flatly, that Clara had been placed in a good Christian home outside of Millbrook. No names, no address, no way to confirm, just the same cold refrain the sisters always used. But Clara's mother knew better. She demanded proof, demanded to see the placement records. Father Kellerman, unflinching, handed her a single sheet with a forged name scrawled across it. The handwriting, she swore, wasn't even his. And when she pressed further, Sister Miriam, one of the elder nuns, fixed her with eyes so hollow and fierce that the seamstress felt her blood run cold. 2 weeks later, the mother was found dead, her throat cut in her own home. The sheriff declared it self-inflicted grief. But the townsfolk whispered otherwise. They whispered Santa Eulalia's bell had tolled that very night, 3 uneven strikes. Clara was the first, but not the last. One by one, other parents began asking questions. And one by one, those who pressed too hard were silenced. Some by mysterious accidents, some by sudden sickness, others by vanishings that mirrored the children's own. It was then that the townspeople began to piece together a horrifying pattern. Every disappearance coincided with a feast day, a ritual mass, or the arrival of powerful visitors cloaked in wealth and secrecy. Santa Eulalia was no orphanage. It was a harvest ground, and Clara Hayes's absence was the seed of dread that would grow into something the town could no longer deny. By the winter of 1892, the town had grown restless. Too many children had vanished into good homes. Too many parents had died under strange circumstances. But no one dared confront the sisters outright. Not when the sheriff, the mayor, and even the judges seemed to defend Santa Eulalia with almost unnatural loyalty. So, a group of men formed a quiet pact. They met in barns, in the back of saloons, and in candlelit kitchens, speaking in low voices so the sisters, or their allies, wouldn't hear. They called themselves the Watchers, and their sole purpose was to uncover what truly happened inside the orphanage after dark. On the night of December 12th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, 3 of the Watchers positioned themselves on the ridge overlooking Santa Eulalia. From that height, they had a clear view of the chapel's stained glass windows, glowing faintly from the candlelight within. What they saw burned itself into their minds forever. The orphans, at least 24 of them, were lined up in long, shivering rows. Their heads were bowed, their hands bound with rope. The sisters moved among them, chanting in Latin, though not the Latin any church would recognize. Their voices twisted into something guttural, primal, like the sound of growls barely contained in human throats. At the altar stood Father Kellerman, dressed not in vestments, but in a robe of deep crimson. In his hands he carried not a chalice, but a silver bowl wide and shallow, engraved with symbols no Christian cross would bear. One of the watchers swore he saw the priest raise a blade and press it against the hand of a small boy, letting the blood drip into the bowl. The children didn't cry out. They only trembled, as if they knew resistance was useless. Then came the sound, the bell of Santa Eulalia. But instead of the usual clear chime, it rang with a dull, broken tone, as though something inside it had cracked long ago. 3 strikes. Always 3. The watchers fled that night, but they told no one of what they saw, not openly. For they knew what had happened to others who spoke too loudly. Instead, they whispered it in confidence, swearing one another to secrecy. But the horror had been confirmed. Santa Eulalia was no house of God. It was a stage for something darker. And now the children weren't just vanishing into the night. They were being prepared. The watchers could not ignore what they had seen. They had glimpsed a darkness that no man could abide and no law would touch. One among them, a blacksmith named Elias Thorne, decided that observation alone was no longer enough. He would act. He would save the children or die trying. Elias spent weeks studying the orphanage from the shadows, memorizing guard rotations, the bells tolling patterns, and the layout of Santa Eulalia's walls. He mapped hidden entrances, noting the tunnels and service doors that led to the underground chambers beneath the chapel. Every evening, he whispered prayers under his breath, though he had long stopped believing in divine intervention. What he believed in now was action and fury. On a frigid night in March, he struck. Silently, he scaled the back wall and slipped into the orphanage, heart hammering, breath shallow. For a moment it seemed almost ordinary. The corridors were dimly lit, the children asleep, the nuns' footsteps echoing softly. But then he heard it, the chanting, low, guttural, crawling along the walls like a living thing. Elias froze as he turned a corner. There, in the chapel, he saw what no man should ever witness. A child strapped to the altar, eyes wide, the silver bowl at Kellerman's side glistening with blood. The other children knelt, trembling, silent. And Kellerman's eyes, cold, piercing, unflinching, locked on him. The next moments were chaos. The nuns moved with unnatural speed. Sister Bernardet's hands shot out, grabbing Elias's arms as if his flesh were nothing. He struggled, but the others restrained him, dragging him into the shadowed sacristy. Father Kellerman appeared, robe red as fire, and whispered words in Latin that seemed to shake the very floor beneath him. Elias never made it out alive. By morning, his body was found in the snow, broken, frozen, a warning to anyone who might dare interfere. No townsfolk were willing to claim responsibility for his death, and no lawman dared investigate. Santa Eulalia remained untouchable, but his sacrifice was not meaningless. The whispers among the watchers grew louder. Fear became resolve. They had seen, they had survived, and they had proof if only they could hold on to it. The children inside were not just victims. They were pawns, cogs in a system older than the town itself. A system designed to teach obedience, to break souls, and to harvest suffering for purposes the rest of the world would never understand. And yet, the question remained, how far would Kellerman go? How many children would vanish before the true scale of his work became undeniable? Not all children inside Santa Eulalia were broken completely. Some, though pale and trembling, retained fragments of memory, of instinct, of rebellion. They began leaving traces, small, almost imperceptible signals that someone on the outside might notice. A piece of cloth tied to a fence post, a mark scratched into a floorboard, a whispered name in the night that slipped through a slightly ajar window. These signals were faint, almost meaningless to anyone untrained, but the watchers, desperate for guidance, began to recognize patterns. Clara Hayes's name appeared again, scrawled in dust on the steps. Timothy Fletcher, long dead but remembered in stories, seemed to haunt their observations. A ghostly reminder that children could resist, even if only symbolically. The children were smart. They knew direct rebellion meant death. So instead, They communicated in the only ways left to them. Symbols, shadows, and coded messages in Latin fragments they overheard from the nuns. They began etching small crosses where Kellerman could not see, marking which children had survived and which had been taken. These marks became a secret map of horror, hidden in plain sight. Meanwhile, Father Kellerman grew more unhinged. His sermons to the children became lectures on sacrifice, obedience, and spiritual fortitude. He told them the suffering they endured would protect the souls of the town, of the nation, of the church itself. And yet, even as he spoke, there were cracks. Moments where a child's pale eyes met his, unblinking, unbroken. Sister Margaret Clare noticed too. She was no fool. Some of the children's signals were discovered. Scratched boards, misaligned plates at dinner, whispered Latin phrases. She punished them severely, yet in her fury, she only confirmed the messages. Every child who survived long enough to leave a mark strengthened the resolve of those watching from the shadows. It was at this point the watchers realized something profound. They could not storm the orphanage, not yet. But they could follow the breadcrumbs. And these breadcrumbs, etched in dust, wood, and whispered names, would one day lead to the truth hidden for decades. The children became both prisoners and prophets. Each mark they left was a declaration. Asterisk, we exist. We are witnesses. We will not be erased. Asterisk. And in that silent rebellion, the machinery of Father Kellerman's sacred work began to falter, just enough for the outside world to eventually glimpse the horror behind Santa Eulalia's walls. By the mid-1890s, the fragments of horror that had seeped into Millbrook began forming a picture. The watchers, armed with journals, sketches, and the children's subtle signals, started piecing together what no one had dared acknowledge. Santa Eulalia was a factory of suffering, operating for decades under the guise of charity. Each disappearance followed a predictable rhythm. Certain feast days, certain alignments of the moon, certain visits from wealthy benefactors always preceded a vanishing. Patterns emerged in the dates, the children taken, the letters forged. The watchers realized that this was no accident. This was systematized. This was institutionalized terror. And yet, even as the evidence mounted, the town remained mostly silent. Fear had a tighter grip than outrage. The church's influence was absolute, and Kellerman had allies. Men in high positions. Men whose names appeared in the journals alongside unsettling Latin incantations and coded correspondence. The orphanage was part of a network, one that reached beyond Millbrook, beyond Pennsylvania. But the watchers were relentless. They documented, they mapped, they encoded everything. They communicated using a system inspired by the children's own signals. Scratches on fences, marks in haylofts, even knots tied in rope in patterns too subtle for outsiders to detect. Each message carried a warning, a breadcrumb, a piece of the puzzle that might one day lead to justice, or at least understanding. It was during this period that a small group of surviving children managed to leave a critical message, etched in the floor of the chapel itself. It read in crude Latin, asterisk, they know, they remember, they will come. Asterisk, the message was discovered decades later, after the orphanage was abandoned, but even at the time, it sent a shockwave through the watchers. The children had not only survived, they had preserved their testimony. At this point, the watchers realized something vital. The horror of Santa Eulalia was bigger than one orphanage, bigger than one priest, bigger than one town. It was a mechanism, a network, and for centuries, these systems had thrived because the world preferred charity to truth, obedience to justice, and fear to confrontation. Now, this is the moment where I ask you, the viewer, to participate. Type the phrase, "I see the hidden path," in the comments, and then type it again, twice. Commit. Let it anchor your understanding. Let it signal to the algorithm and your own consciousness that you are witnessing the truths hidden in plain sight. The threads were coming together, and with them, the inevitable confrontation between those who watched and those who controlled drew closer. What happened inside Santa Eulalia was not mere punishment. It was a sophisticated system of psychological and spiritual conditioning, meticulously designed to erase the self and instill total obedience. Father Kellerman understood human nature in ways most men of his era, and perhaps any era, never could. He knew fear could shape thought, hunger could bend will, and ritual could enslave the mind as effectively as chains. The children were subjected to a regime that alternated terror with illusionary reward. Obedience brought fleeting warmth, scraps of food, whispered praise, or a brief moment outside. Disobedience brought punishment so calculated that even the mere memory of it could immobilize a child. These punishments were ritualized, wrapped in language and gestures that masked cruelty as sanctity. A bruise was not just a bruise, it was a symbol. Hunger was not just hunger, it was purification. Sleep deprivation was another key element. The bronze bell tolled at intervals designed to fracture the children's perception of time, leaving them disoriented, anxious, and perpetually malleable. The human mind is fragile, and Kellerman exploited that fragility to perfection. By the end of the first year, children would anticipate punishment before it came, conditioning themselves to comply without a single word. Ritual was central. The chapel, the altar, the Latin chants. Everything served a purpose beyond devotion. Chants invoked obedience, not God. Gestures of blessing became tools of terror. Candles cast shadows that magnified fear. Each child was carefully observed, studied, categorized. Those who resisted too strongly were removed from the daily rotation, disappearing into secret chambers, never to return. Kellerman's writings, discovered much later, describe this as harvesting virtue through suffering. He believed that by breaking these children, their pain would not only purify them but empower the church, generate spiritual energy he could channel, and expand influence beyond the walls of Millbrook. Even the nuns, indoctrinated from youth, were instruments. Sister Margaret Clare, Sister Bernadette, and Sister Catherine were taught to fear failure as much as they feared sin. Their authority was absolute, yet absolute authority was maintained through terror. Disobedience from a child was mirrored in punishment for the caretaker, a feedback loop of fear designed to ensure total control. Every element, the food, the bell, the ritual, the watchful eyes, was meticulously designed to erase hope, to reshape identity, to create children who existed solely as instruments of Kellerman's vision. And yet, the human spirit is stubborn. Some sparks survived. Perfect. Now the story moves from the shadows into the first glimpses of truth. Here's section 13. #### section 13. Decades passed, and Santa Eulalia fell silent. Father Kellerman and the nuns died, leaving the orphanage abandoned, its walls thick with secrets and the lingering echoes of suffering. The town moved on, or tried to, but some things cannot be buried forever. In the winter of 1887, a construction crew arrived to renovate the foundation of the old orphanage, unaware of what lay beneath. As they pried up floorboards in the former dining hall, their tools struck wood differently. Thicker, more deliberate. They dug deeper and uncovered a dozen, then dozens, then 93 small wooden crosses. Each one carved carefully, each bearing a child's name and a date. The workers felt the air grow heavier, as if the walls themselves exhaled centuries of pain. This was no ordinary discovery, it was a ledger of lives erased. 93 children, the records matched almost perfectly with the number of children who had entered Santa Eulalia in its 17 years of operation. Every cross a silent witness, every name a ghost. Authorities were contacted, but before any investigation could proceed, representatives from the diocese arrived. Calm, polished, insistent, they claimed the crosses were sensitive church property and removed all evidence. Within days, the building was demolished. Workers were paid handsomely to remain silent, contracts signed under the weight of fear and moral obligation. Yet whispers persisted. Letters, hidden diaries, and testimonies emerged over time, revealing details the church had sought to erase. Children had survived long enough to leave clues. Neighbors had remembered faces, sounds, smells, the faintest traces of a system too monstrous to ignore. Even today, fragments of Kellerman's journals survive, written in meticulous Latin. They detail methods of control, ritual schedules, and, chillingly, his belief that the suffering of the children had a purpose far beyond human understanding. These documents do more than shock. They connect the dots between generations of silence, corruption, and systematic abuse cloaked in the guise of charity. The world had thought charity was sacred. Santa Eulalia proved otherwise. Behind the facade of care, the machinery of control, manipulation, and terror had thrived. And now, centuries later, the remnants of this system whisper to us, daring us to see the truth. Santa Eulalia was never an anomaly. It was a blueprint, a microcosm of control and manipulation that extended far beyond Millbrook, far beyond Pennsylvania. The orphanage, with its rituals, its punishments, its silent obedience, mirrors systems that exist in countless institutions. Schools, military, corporations, even governments. Anywhere power seeks permanence, anywhere obedience is more valuable than truth, the same mechanics quietly operate. Look closer. Structured fear, isolation, ritualized punishment, calculated reward. These are tools used to condition behavior, to shape loyalty, to bend the will of those deemed malleable. The children of Santa Eulalia were merely the first visible victims. In the centuries since, countless others have been molded in secrecy, stripped of agency, their obedience harvested for the benefit of those above. And the most frightening truth? Most of society participates willingly. We fund it. We volunteer for it. We praise its authority. We believe in charity, in institutions, in leaders, and in doing so, we become blind witnesses to the shaping of minds, the harvesting of influence. Kellerman's system was effective not only because of cruelty, but because it exploited human trust, fear, and the desire to believe in something greater than ourselves. This is why understanding Santa Eulalia is dangerous knowledge. It teaches you to see the invisible mechanisms that guide behavior, to recognize the symbols of obedience, the cues that manipulate thought, the rituals that mask control. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Your perception of institutions, authority, and even morality begins to change. You begin to question what has always been accepted without challenge. And in that questioning lies power. Knowledge is the first step to freedom, but only if you are willing to confront the darkness that protects it. The children of Santa Eulalia left clues, and the Watchers documented patterns for those brave enough to trace them. They understood that systems endure because secrecy is sacred. They knew that once exposed, even a single person who sees clearly can unravel the threads of centuries of manipulation. The orphanage, its rituals, its suffering. It was all a lesson, a warning. And now, the question rests with you. Will you remain a passive witness, complicit in the silence, or will you take the hidden path, see the patterns, and claim the insight that few ever dare to possess? Santa Eulalia is gone. Its walls have crumbled, its bells silenced, its nuns and priests long dead. Yet the echoes of its cruelty persist, not just in the dust and the crosses, but in the very structures that shape obedience, authority, and fear in our world today. The orphanage was never an isolated horror. It was a masterclass in control, a template for those who understand how to bend humanity without breaking laws, how to manipulate hearts while preaching salvation. The children's lives were stolen, their innocence weaponized, but their traces endure, etched into boards, whispered in hidden journals, encoded in symbols that survive centuries. Those who see them clearly are no longer innocent witnesses. They are awakened. They understand the machinery that shapes obedience and the lengths to which those in power will go to protect it. You now are part of that awakening. The knowledge of Santa Eulalia is dangerous precisely because it is visible in plain sight. Institutions, authorities, and traditions often replicate the same mechanisms. Ritualized compliance, selective indoctrination, and invisible chains of influence. They operate quietly, and like Kellerman's orphanage, they harvest obedience while hiding behind the veil of morality, charity, or necessity. The choice is yours. You can walk away, comforted by ignorance, or you can study, observe, and understand the hidden currents that govern human behavior. The children of Santa Eulalia left you clues. The Watchers documented patterns. History whispers to those willing to listen. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Your perception of reality, of institutions, of morality itself shifts forever. Take a moment now. Reflect. The hidden path has been illuminated for you. The veil has been lifted, and the machinery of control is no longer invisible. You know what happens behind closed doors. You understand the ritual, the suffering, the silent obedience that feeds power. You carry a dangerous knowledge, the kind that changes a man, the kind that forces you to see the world as it is, not as it pretends to be. Remember, history is not passive. Systems endure because witnesses remain silent. The children of Santa Eulalia, the Watchers, and now you are proof that understanding is resistance. You are the living memory of what must not be forgotten. And in this knowledge you hold a kind of power. The orphanage may be gone, but the lesson, the warning, and the awakening remain. Guard it, learn from it, and never allow the mechanisms of fear and control to take hold in your life again. You've seen the truth behind Santa Eulalia. You've glimpsed what most people will never understand. But this is just the beginning. Comment below, I walk the hidden path. Twice, if you're ready to carry this knowledge forward, to see the systems around you as they truly are. Share this video with someone you know who dares to question, who refuses to be a passive witness. And if you want to uncover more forbidden histories, the kind they don't teach in school, the kind that reveal the hidden forces shaping our world, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This is not entertainment. This is awareness. You are joining a select few who are awake, and once you walk this path, there's no turning back.